In this session, we're discussing the rise to prominence of Broadway theater, and specifically the Broadway musical. We'll be looking, of course, at Black Broadway, and we've already talked a little bit about Shuffle Along, but we'll talk about some other productions and figures of importance in Black Broadway. We'll be talking about Ziegfeld's Follies. They are some productions that really brought a lot of attention to Broadway and really helped to emphasize the elaborate set designs and elaborate costume designs that became such a big part of it, so that when you go to see a Broadway show now, people are still very interested, obviously, in the sets and the production design in general, and of course the costumes. And sometimes when a particularly elaborate costume comes marching out, a character comes out in a particularly elaborate costume, that gets applause all on its own, and some of that started with Ziegfeld's Follies. And we'll also talk about the rise of the book musical. So we'll talk about how early musicals were organized really, in a sense, as a collection of songs, some of which were interchangeable, so that it really didn't matter if you played all the songs. The plots are almost non-existent in really early Broadway productions. And in some cases, like some of the Ziegfeld Follies, there really was no plot at all for some of them, not all of them. But the rise of the book musical meant that plot became much more of a concern, and more of a almost Wagnerian influenced through composition became part of a concern. So those are the topics for today. Let's get to it. Starting with a reminder then, here's of course the sheet music for I'm Wild About Harry from the famous and very successful Black Broadway show Shuffle Along from 1921 by U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel. And we've discussed this before, we're not going to go through it again, but there are several important black performers on Broadway at this time, and in New York City theaters, that some of whom derive from this production, so some really important black composers, performers, and other productions come out of this one, and then some just inspired by this and so on. So, for instance, in the later 20s, you of course have Andy Razaf and Fats Waller starting to write musicals, in part inspired by Shuffle Along, and we'll see that William Grant Still, of course, was in the pit orchestra and becomes a very important and prominent composer in the 1930s, and already starting in the 20s, but certainly by the 30s. And then we'll see, of course, how other acts that aren't directly related to this also developed, and that's what we'll talk about next with Bert Williams. Here's Bert Williams with George Walker. Bert Williams is the man in blackface. You can tell with the exaggerated makeup that he's wearing. He is a black man wearing blackface. So here we have that issue that we talked about before about representation and this idea of blacks wearing blackface, partly as a means of capitulating to ideas about black theater. But you can see George Walker's now wearing it. So we might ask, is this really capitulating? Because it is true that Bert Williams was a lighter-skinned black man than George Walker. So some people say there's no real concrete evidence one way or the other. We can read this in various ways, but some people suggest that it's because George Walker was already dark, that he didn't need to black up. But it's not just a matter of already being dark. Notice that the way that the makeup works here is it is a gross exaggeration. That's the point. So why was it that George Walker didn't have to wear it? Part of that has to do with the differing roles that they're playing as well. So this is one of the most celebrated comedy teams of early vaudeville and early Broadway era. In 1893, they joined several West Coast minstrel shows, or rather Bert Williams did, and that's where he met George Walker. They called their act Two Real Coons. So again, this idea of the authentic, right? Even though they're using this term that's becoming more and more of a pejorative term. Williams plays the dumb character. He plays the character that's related to the history of Jim Crow, whereas Walker's playing the more sophisticated Zip Coon type character, but not exactly Zip Coon either. He really is somewhat sophisticated. Some people think of this as ironic because Bert Williams himself was such a sophisticate. He was such an intelligent man, and here he's playing the exact opposite of that. His vocal delivery and personality, both on and off stage, in contradistinction to this character, came to represent the dignity and the cleverness of African American performance. He was appealing to white audiences, but did not seem to compromise his professional standing in the manner of minstrelsy. Now, I'm going to talk about this more in one of the podcast episodes, the one dealing with Burt Williams and with the issue of blacks wearing blackface. But there are various clever things that he manages to pull off in his persona as the so-called Jonah Man, which we'll talk about in a moment, that made him appealing to whites, and yet it didn't require that he become obsequious or that he just cater to the stereotypes and racial prejudice of whites, that he was able to work with this picture of the downtrodden to not just gain sympathy, but to gain a kind of dignity out of it, and we'll talk more about that. So he appeared both of them appeared in press photos as immaculately dressed to reinforce that they were playing characters on stage. We saw this with white people with blackface before, when you have the picture of the white person as the actor in a sort of dignified state of dress, and then you have them dressed up in the manner of blackface with obviously the cork on their face and then the ill-fitting clothes and all the rest. Still, they received a great deal of criticism from the black press. Walker was the businessman of the two and the public relations officer, and he was very outspoken. He wrote several articles to various African-American newspapers, of which there were many at this point, talking about issues of compensation and their role in racial uplift. And he thought that they did not have a pernicious effect on the racial advancement of black people, but that they were actually doing work through their entertainment efforts. He created the Williams and Walker Glee Club in 1905. This is one of the first fan clubs that you would subscribe to, and you would get special products from them and so on. And this helped bring in revenue for them, and it helped create interest in their act. And they touted the need for an Ethiopian theater, an all-black theater. Ethiopian here doesn't really mean Ethiopia. It just means all-black, right? He even justified their early moniker of two real coons by declaring the following. He wrote, "We thought that, as there seemed to be a great demand for black faces on stage, we could do all we could to get what we felt belonged to us by the law of nature." So in other words, why let the white people get all the revenue from blackface performance when nature had made them black, right? And one of the things he doesn't say, maybe because he thought it would be too controversial, or I don't know why he doesn't, but they really, their act is not simply capitulating to the stereotypes of black minstrelsy and blackface minstrelsy. What they really seem to be doing is playing with those stereotypes and making you question the stereotypes. And we'll see that in the song Nobody by Burt Williams. The critic Lester Walton in 1912 wrote that Burt Williams, quote, never degrades his race in his work. He makes Negro mannerisms a telling feature, right? So these mannerisms are a part of giving rise to or creating a character. In various essays, Williams tended to emphasize the work of comedy and rejected the idea of someone having a gift or coming to it naturally. He didn't like the idea that blacks were naturally musical, or that they were naturally given to pratfalls or whatever comic antics, that this was work, right? So he's emphasizing, we've talked about this before, going back to at least the 1820s, this idea of the nobility of work, and is work that's not working the land noble, and how do you make it noble? How do you make it clear it's noble? He wrote, "Troubles are only funny when you pin them to one particular individual. And that individual, the fellow who is the goat, must be the man who is singing the song or telling the story. Then the audience can picture in their mind's eye and see him in the thick, that should be thick, of his misfortunes," right? So you're seeing it acted out in front of you, but also the way that he tells his story allows you to see the things that he's talking about. He writes also in another essay, "As I sit in a barbershop, a railroad station, or ride in a car, I always have my eyes open for the observation of people. I never tire of them. And everybody, I don't care how ignorant or how apparently uninteresting, is human. And if you get close to him, he can generally teach you a lesson in philosophy. The people who have had the hardest and saddest lives are often the most philosophical." Notice he's kind of justifying this use of a underprivileged, downtrodden character to say that you're actually seeing something philosophical. We might even say existentialist, as I'll try to demonstrate in that podcast episode about the plight here, right? And notice also, though, he's not putting himself in legal. He's not saying that, well, I'm also downtrodden. I'm also a person working in a barbershop or working on a railroad station. He's not. He's saying that when he's there, he's observing them, right? So he's already creating this distance. Now, we might think of that as being special pleading in some fashion, or maybe we might somewhat think that is an unfortunate stance he's taken. I don't know. There are lots of different ways to look at this, but he's clearly pitching himself as someone who is not the kind of person he's portraying on stage, but that the kind of person he's portraying on stage reveals something about humanity. He writes, "Makeup is a great protection." Notice that reinforces a lot of things I've been saying about blackface makeup, right? Makeup is a great protection. I shuffle onto the stage not as myself, but as a lazy, slow-going Negro. He was a supporter of Booker T. Washington, and so he really believed in individual action, personal responsibility, and tact, courtesy toward others. Bert Williams appeared in the Follies from 1910 until 1919. The only year he didn't show up was 1913 when he was doing a tour of his own. We'll talk about the significance of the Follies in a moment, but I want to emphasize how important Bert Williams was to this roughly a full decade of the Follies, and to many people's minds, one of the richest decades of the Follies. The Follies was basically a variety show, and so you had these comic skits, you had some slightly, not really serious dramatic, but more lyrical dramatic moments, and then you had people just singing songs, and you had dances, and these tableaux vivants, right, these sort of living sculptures, all this stuff. Now, owing to the prejudice of the time, what we're talking about, of course, here is an entertainment of all white people. All the people on the stage, all the composers and producers, they're all white. The only black faces around would have been stagehands and people like that. So because of the racism of the time, several of the performers objected to the idea of sharing the stage with Bert Williams and even sharing backstage space with Bert Williams. And so they called a meeting and had Ziegfeld come. And during this meeting, they objected to the idea of Bert Williams being there. They wanted Ziegfeld to not hire him. Ziegfeld turned to them, and he said that everyone in these productions are replaceable, except for Bert Williams. He's the only one that can't be replaced. Now, that's a pretty significant statement, right, from this white entrepreneur and impresario regarding a black entertainer. That any of them, he's basically threatening them with being fired. If they continue to object to the idea of Bert Williams being there, they can lose their jobs. They're replaceable. He's not. Now, this didn't turn out to be an exaggeration. Bert Williams, alongside people like W.C. Fields and for a while there Will Rogers, he was one of the major draws to the Ziegfeld Follies, that at least among the men. We'll talk a bit about the female aspect of the Ziegfeld Follies, and that clearly was the most celebrated part of the Follies. But as far as the male presences are concerned, Bert Williams loomed large. Not only that, he's one of the few entertainers, W.C. Fields is the other one, who, and for a while also Will Rogers, so those three, they wrote their own material, and Bert Williams brought entire sketches, entire comic acts that he would perform. For the first several years, he didn't perform with white entertainers. He would be on stage by himself, and if there were multiple roles, he played all the roles. And there was usually a comic song that he would write. So he was his own composer, his own writer, and of course a brilliant entertainer. From Jim Crow to the Jonah Man, right? So he says at one point about his character, the Jonah Man, which we'll talk about on the next slide. The Jonah Man is the man who, even if it rains soup, could be found with a fork in his hand and no spoon in sight. The man whose fighting relatives come to visit him and whose head is always dented by the furniture they throw at each other. So the Jonah Man is his main character. Now, we'll talk more about this and I'll save most of it for the podcast episode where I really discuss what the Jonah Man is and what's important about it. But basically, he's this downtrodden extension of the Jim Crow character. But instead of just being this lazy guy, he's the unfortunate guy, and he's the unfortunate guy that bears up under his misfortune. He's able to deal with his misfortune rather well, and with a sense of humor, and with a sense of what we might call a kind of existentialist philosophical understanding. He just accepts that this is the way life is, that one can't expect great things from life necessarily. He wrote a song for that character, and many of his songs are meant to be for that character, the Jonah Man character. The famous song, though, the most important, is from 1906, and that's Nobody. And it's from the musical he did with George Walker called Abyssinia. Williams and Walker, they co-wrote the music for the play overall, and then Williams, he mostly wrote the music for this particular song. He didn't write the lyrics. The lyrics are by another gentleman. The story alluded to a love interest, which is not the story of the play overall, which is not usually typically tolerated in black theater of the time. But Nobody is the important thing here, and I want you to listen to the song. It became his signature song, and he sang it. He was so identified with it, he came to regret it a little bit, because he wound up having to sing it at nearly every public performance for the rest of his life. So every musical that had him in it, they worked Nobody in there somehow, because that was such a signature song. That was the song that sometimes he didn't sing the whole thing. He would just come out and sing part of the refrain, and everybody would clap because they recognized that as being his kind of calling card. But he performed it in some version in almost all of his public performances for the rest of his life. The song remained in the Columbia catalog well into the 1930s, which might not seem all that remarkable, but that's not the case for most songs. And it may have sold, although it's impossible to tell for sure because the records on such sales are not kept very well, but it may have sold around 150,000 copies. So listen to that podcast for more on Burt Williams. Let's move now to the revue era, the early era of the Broadway musical. In the teens and early 20s, Tin Pan Alley and Broadway musicals were very closely aligned. We talked about that a bit last time. Even so-called book musicals, musicals that had a real plot, were only loosely tied to a narrative. For the most part, they were just a collection of songs that were strung together that people hoped would be hit songs, right? So these songs can all be replaced. If it's not working, then you just take out one love song and replace it with another. It's not like the song is about anything specific. They're all about these very generalized emotions. And so having Tin Pan Alley right up the street from Broadway was perfect, because these impresarios and producers, they would just go to Tin Pan Alley. We saw a picture before of the listening room, the listening parlor at a Tin Pan Alley publishing company. And so the idea is that you would come and these songwriters would come out and they would pitch their songs, hoping that you would buy them and put them in your show, and then they could sell sheet music based on those songs and so on. And for the most part, this is how early Broadway worked. It was just a string of these songs brought together in a kind of almost more of a concert than anything else, with some aspects acted out. But the narratives were largely beside the point. And that was especially true with the Ziegfeld Follies. Some of the Ziegfeld Follies had some kind of loose narrative, but for the most part, they were just variety shows. Or many of these shows were just mere reviews, as they're called, no real narrative at all. And they were sometimes called follies or scandals, because the girls were rather scantily clad, as we'll see in a moment. Many of these follies were produced by the legendary impresario Florenz Ziegfeld. And he was famous in part for the Ziegfeld girls, and we'll see plenty of examples of that coming up. He was inspired by the Parisian Follies Bergère. He was in Paris for several years, and he was very interested in these shows, which were kind of burlesque shows. The girls didn't strip exactly, but they wore revealing costumes and did these kind of not exactly erotic, but certainly involved dances that people seem to enjoy. And so he ran the Ziegfeld Follies from 1907 until 1931, quite a long time. And we saw that the 1910s were dominated by Burt Williams, and later years were featured other performers more heavily. The high water mark was in the teens and the early 20s for these pieces. The Follies were elaborate, lush revues, so they were a combination of skits, songs, novelty acts, and dance numbers, with intricate, gorgeous sets designed by Joseph Urban. Joseph Urban's a very important designer of this period. Sumptuous costumes, beautiful girls, huge synchronized ensemble pieces, so moving around, sometimes not exactly dancing, just moving around the stage in this synchronized, coordinated fashion. And then tableau vivant, especially as designed by Ben Ali Hagen. And a tableau vivant is literally a living picture. So what you do is you take these, usually it's women, and you arrange them into some kind of picture. We'll see some examples in a moment. And then they use the music of composers such as Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, and Jerome Kern, so some of the major composers of the era. Here you see some of those tableaux vivants. You can see in the first one you have these large pillars, and the women are all sort of posed there with the very short skirts. And then you have the woman in the more elaborate gown perched between a lion and I guess that's a tiger. I'm not sure. They might both be lions. Obviously not the safest thing. I'm not even sure how this particular thing was done, how they controlled the lions or if they just relied on them to be trained. I don't know the full story behind this, but it's a striking picture, and that's the point. A tableau vivant, in general, you're not moving much. You might take one pose and then shift to another pose, but the idea is that you're creating this larger picture. Now, there were laws in New York about nudity on stage at the time, and for the most part, you couldn't have a naked woman on stage. The exception was the tableau vivant, because it was kind of a living sculpture, and so there's no distinction in the law's mind at this time between an actual sculpture, often of a nude woman, or a living sculpture, an actual nude woman. As long as she's not moving, it was thought of as being somewhat less erotic, and of course there were certain poses that would have been forbidden. But the point is that part of these follies, at least for men, and it wasn't just men that came to see them, but certainly a large portion of the audience would have been men. Part of the attraction here is the titillation, the idea that you're going to get to see these gorgeous women half naked or sometimes even close to fully naked. Obviously, the lower portions were generally covered in some fashion, or you were seeing them merely from behind or whatever. But that's part of the attraction here. You can see in the one to the right, this is obviously meant to be a kind of circus. That's an Uncle Sam. An Uncle Sam type figure there next to the elephant. Again, notice the use of these exotic animals. And then you have the sort of ballerina figure on top and a clown figure to Uncle Sam's right, our left, and so on. So again, these living pictures. We'll see some more on the next slide. That's a striking one, and here you can see what I meant by having these women who are partially nude. All their breasts are exposed here. Their lower genital regions are not. They're covered up with this piece of what looks like brass or something that makes them blend in a little more to that crown figure. So you can see that this is kind of a living crown. It's meant to be a crown for like a king or a queen, but it's a huge size so that these women are part of it. Then you can see another one with a partially nude woman on a couch there. I don't know if she's supposed to be dead or what, but this is obviously a scene from some kind of antiquity, perhaps ancient Egypt is what it looks like to me. But then you also have some other signifiers here. But the idea, and you can also see the two women that are very much blended into the couch if you look very closely behind the woman who's lying on her back, or I'm sorry, below the woman lying on her back. So notice they're striking a pose here, right? This is meant to be a tableau vivant. There might have been a scene before it, but here they would have held that pose for a bit for the enjoyment of the audience. Now, the Ziegfeld girls are a major part of what attracts people to these shows. Let's take a look at some more slides. And here you can see some of the elaborate costumes, right? So you have the stars revolving around the young woman's head, and she's in some kind of heavenly situation here, I guess. And then you have the two women with the what look like bikini tops, and then the flowing gowns and the very huge headdresses, right? So the costumes were a major part of what people were looking for in the Ziegfeld Follies. Now, of course, some very famous women were associated with these follies. For instance, there's some incredibly famous performers like W.C. Fields, who we've mentioned before. Anna Held, that's who you're seeing in the larger picture there, a very pretty picture, famous publicity photograph of Anna Held from that period. Burt Williams, we've already talked about. Eddie Cantor, a very important shouter and a radio figure who got one of his starts was with the Ziegfeld Follies. Josephine Baker, the very famous black dancer. So here's another black artist that was working for a while with the Follies. She got sick of racism in the U.S. and moved to Europe, made the rest of her living in Europe. Fanny Brice, and that's who you're seeing down at the bottom there, a comedy singer, a comic singer. Will Rogers, the storyteller. Ed Wynn, the great comedian, and he's in one of the great episodes of Twilight Zone, if you feel like checking him out. Sophie Tucker, the famous shouter and blues singer of the early 20th century. Bob Hope got his start with Ziegfeld Follies and then went on to a movie career. Louise Brooks, Ruth Etting, a very famous singer. He became known as the glorifier of the American girl, and so his chorus girls were exceedingly famous and often celebrated. They very often wore revealing costumes and nude suits, so sometimes they would wear suits. Remember, they were often dancing and singing, so they're moving around, so they couldn't actually be naked. So they would wear these nude suits, so it looked like they were naked from a distance. We might see much of this as exploitative, but in the 1920s, it was considered a representation of the liberation of women, of the liberated woman. Remember that the 1920s is a period where the notion of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable when it comes to female comportment is up for grabs. This is the era of the flapper. This is the jazz age, right? So Zelda Fitzgerald and figures like that, where a certain amount of promiscuity wasn't frowned upon in quite the same way as it had been before. The idea wasn't that young women necessarily did go right out and get married. Now, don't get me wrong. The older generation, the generation of parents, would certainly have looked askance at all of this. They're not condoning the notion that their young daughters go out and have promiscuous affairs or have affairs with married men, and then maybe they'll get married and maybe they won't. But it's the younger generation that's really developing these new ideals of what it means to be modern. And part of that had to do with drinking. Part of that had to do with gambling. Part of that had to do with a certain amount of licentiousness and openness to sexuality, right? Even the bob haircut, a very famous haircut for women, and a few of these women might have a sort of bob. None of them are super distinct, but the bob haircut was thought of as a new mode of femininity. Riding a bicycle in the late 19th century and early 20th century was a new mode of femininity that it allowed unmarried women to travel around, usually with friends, but relatively unchaperoned, changed dating structures. Basically, the end of the 19th century, right into the 1920s, this is a very important moment for changes in how people think of women, right? This is the suffrage movement. This is the women being involved in protest to alcohol consumption, so prohibition. They were the major voting bloc for that and the supporters of that. So you have women on both sides here. You have some women that say, oh no, the new woman is all about the exploration of sexuality and the nightlife and so on. And then you have other women who say, no, the new woman is about responsibility and voting rights and keeping people from drinking and abusing themselves. One of the ways that he drummed up popularity for his shows was to have these promotional photographs of women, and you can see these are chorus girls. They're women that would have been dancing or would have been part of the tableau vivant, and you can see that the one to the left, to our left, is wearing a kind of see-through gown, almost like negligee, right? And she's in this very specific pose, showing off her legs and her arms, and she has a kind of sophisticated look there in front of this, what looks to me to be probably an 18th century bit of drapery, right? So this is obviously a very carefully cultivated photograph that is meant for publicity, that is meant to that you would buy in the lobby when you go to these shows as a memento. Maybe you try to get her to sign it if you met her backstage or whatever. They were collector's items, and they were ways of promoting the shows. And you can see a similar, this one I think is a very fascinating photograph, the one to the right. It has some of the same elements, but it's also got this gauzier kind of finish to it. Part of that is from me expanding it, but part of it is the photograph itself isn't as sharp. Here's some more of those kinds of photographs. You can see that the one to the left, she's obviously meant to represent some kind of depiction of liberty, right? You can see a good bit of her pelvic area. You can't see, obviously, the genitals exactly, but you do see part of the hip exposed there, and the suggestion that her breasts are exposed without actually getting to see them. Again, a very cultivated photograph that's meant to entice you without revealing everything. And then you have a picture in the middle of a kind of takeoff of the magic flute, but of two women in bird costumes kissing, right? A little bit of titillation there. And then obviously all the way to the right, a bare-breasted young woman who's in a flapper hat, right? Very much of the 1920s. Popular songs included, and there's Fanny Brice again, from the Follies included Fanny Brice. Fanny Brice was a woman of Jewish extraction, and she did a lot of Yiddish dialect humor. So not really speaking in Yiddish, but using certain phrases from Yiddish, like obvious ones like Ove and so on, or verklempt, things like that you can figure out what they mean in context, but she would do it with this very exaggerated Jewish accent. She sang a song called Secondhand Rose, where everything that she owns is from a secondhand store, right? Because I guess because it's cheaper or whatever, more affordable, and so it's meant really in the direct sense to depict her lower class status. That was a very famous song in 1921. Eddie Cantor had the Modern Maiden's Prayer, which was in support of women's suffrage. So you can see that the Ziegfeld Follies weren't always relegating women to these sort of stereotypical sex objects. There was also support for the suffrage movement, for women to have the vote. It's a complicated affair in some ways. And then you have Bert Williams' song, Everyone Wants a Key to My Cellar. Obviously a song about drinking during an era that's leading into, or that's already given to, prohibition. And then Ruth Etting, Shine On, Harvest Moon. That's a song that's still somewhat famous, not her version of it, but other versions that have come since. Even the shows that were narrative are mostly forgotten now, even if their songs are remembered. So, for instance, Gershwin's Girl Crazy of 1930, that has several very important songs, including I Got Rhythm, Embraceable You, But Not For Me. Those are three of the biggest Gershwin songs. They're three of my favorites. I don't love I Got Rhythm, the melody necessarily, but the chord progression you play over and over again, as I discussed last session. This was Ethel Merman's stage debut. It also made Ginger Rogers a huge success. But the plot is really just an excuse to allow singing and dancing. A spoiled rich kid starts a dude ranch with showgirls from Broadway as entertainment. So the showgirls are doing dances and singing songs, and he's singing some songs because it's part of the entertainment at the dude ranch. And you can also have these Western scenes, right? Because a dude ranch obviously is where people take a vacation by working on a ranch for a little while. Kind of a silly plot. The plot indeed is so silly, it's so flimsy, that all three film versions of it, and there are 3 film versions of this musical, they just create a new plot and keep all the same songs, right? So the songs don't relate directly to the plot. This Embraceable You is just a love song. I Got Rhythm is about how you dance. I've got rhythm, right? But Not For Me is a song about the loss of romantic love. So that'll fit pretty much any story you can come up with, right? So the plots here are entirely flimsy. They're inconsequential. The plot in the version of this musical that features a relatively young Judy Garland, I can't tell you what that plot is. I don't understand a bit of it, right? It's ridiculously stupid. But the point isn't the plot. The point is the songs. But then things start to change. And that's with the rise of the book musical. This began really to change with Showboat in 1927 by Jerome Kern. And I wrote a little piece that you're supposed to read for this session about Showboat, and specifically about 2 of the songs in Showboat, Can't Help Loving That Man and Old Man River. And I want you to read that for this, and I'll talk about some of these things in greater detail there. This is a musical by Jerome Kern with lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein II. It was produced by Ziegfeld and was really meant to move away from the Follies to create this great musical, right? It was meant to be a great musical, and he spent a lot of money on it. It was meant to be more serious and more cohesive than previous musicals, and this influenced later musicals quite a bit, and they become concerned more with unity and of narrative. Right, so these are called book musicals because of their concern with plot narrative. The book is the text, right, of the musical, and so it's no longer just a series of songs, but really there is a plot here. Now, the plot to Showboat is not unlike it's not totally unlike the plot to Girl Crazy. I mean, basically the plot is that there is a showboat full of entertainers that docks in Natchez, Mississippi, and then the authorities find out that one of the lead singers is of mixed race. She's biracial. She's passing for white. So they have to leave, and that leaves a hole in the roster. The leading man and the leading lady both leave because the leading man is married to the leading lady who's discovered to be biracial, so they have to leave. So then the daughter of the showboat owners becomes the new leading lady, much to the chagrin of her mother. And she marries this gambler, and he becomes the leading man, and then they run off, and the second act deals with her being abandoned by him and creating her own career in Chicago theater. So you can see that what you have here is a kind of flimsy plot still, but it's a plot that deals with real issues: abandonment, the Depression. Even though it's not set in the Depression era, you're dealing with poverty in Chicago. So the 19th century issues of Depression. Biracial elements and the issue of race in general. There are several black characters, and that they sing about being black. Part of Old Man River is this again, existentialist resignation to one's status in life, right? And I talk more about that in that piece that you'll read. So book musicals are more concerned with plot and narrative. Here you can see a scene from the first production of Showboat, and you can see that the audience here is not really an audience. These are also actors. This is a scene where the daughter of the showboat owners, Magnolia, is on the stage. That's her there, and she's being accosted by the villain in this piece, and you can see that the audience is interrupting it. There are two men in the balcony there who keep interrupting the show. So it's a play within a play kind of thing, right? And that justifies the singing in a way that makes it natural. It doesn't seem so weird that people just bust down in the song when, of course, they are stage actors. And so a lot of the songs come about because someone says, oh, sing that song for me, or they're actually performing on stage at that moment. It justifies the musical qualities here to make them seem a little less odd. This is I think this is kind of cool. This is a card here for a production of Stage Boat. Relatively the Ziegfeld production, so it's the original production, and this is something you would have bought in the lobby that you could keep as a memento here. And you can see two of the main actresses embracing, the one that's passing for white and then the person playing Magnolia. This trend is epitomized then by Hammerstein and Rogers with the 1943 Oklahoma. This musical had a phenomenal run, 2,212 performances in its original run. Now musical theater relied less on Tin Pan Alley, and the latter fell into a kind of decline, although it was reinvigorated in a new way with early rock and roll, especially in the 60s, but then it's no longer exactly Tin Pan Alley, it's the Brill Building, and we'll talk about that when we get there next semester. For the most part, Broadway theater moved away from popular music charts altogether for a while. It was a different kind of entertainment, and to some extent, it approximates operetta or classical music to a certain extent. It moves away from being just the hit songs of the day, although it still makes an impact on the charts. It began to take on more characteristics of opera, especially Wagnerian opera. So the idea of it being more through composed, less of a sense of here's the beginning of a song and the end of a song. Characters kind of work their way into and out of songs, and the songs don't end with not always at least, with these big cadences that mark them for applause and so on. The idea is for it to be more of a through composed entertainment. And you have the use of leitmotifs, where certain motives come to signify certain things that you're going to hear on a kind of almost psychological level. There's more concern with large-scale structure, and that large-scale structure is not just here's a song, here's a little bit of speaking, now here's the next song, but something a little bit more thought out. Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, reigned supreme for a while with hits such as South Pacific, King and I, Sound of Music from 1959. So these huge musicals that then became huge musical films and so on. Here's a scene from an early production of the original production of Oklahoma, and then you can see the poster there for the production as well. Oklahoma is obviously set in the West during the expansion of the U.S. And again, it's about romantic entanglements and all the things that musical theater is often about. And here you see another, this is obviously a still, but it's meant from the production, early production. And here you can see the very famous Surrey with the Fringe on Top, which is one of the songs, and in fact it is the song that I'd like you to look at and listen to. You'll see on our syllabus there's a link for a YouTube video for the filmed version of this song, and I'd like you to look at that and then listen to the song. The song, of course, very famously made into a jazz standard by Miles Davis. He has a very famous recording, and it might be worth listening to that. Actually, it's definitely worth listening to that, and I would like you to try to listen to that as well. I might discuss that a bit in our discussion session. That's it for this session.